Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine the sound of wooden wheels creaking over cobbled streets, the weight of a man chained to a cart, his face bruised, body bloodied, dragged through the filth of a hostile city. Crowds jeer. Rotten food is hurled. Children laugh, not knowing they're watching history bleed before them. This wasn't just an execution, it was a spectacle. It was designed to erase a man, not just his flesh, but everything he stood for. That man was William Wallace. You've heard the battle cry, freedom, echoed in theaters. You've seen the war paint, the speeches, the sword raised high in defiance. But that was cinema, that was Braveheart. It was powerful, but it wasn't the whole truth. The real story, it's darker, more complex, and far more disturbing. Because Wallace's true legacy wasn't carved in steel, it was burned into memory by fire, blood, and betrayal. Today, we're not just telling the story of a Scottish rebel. We're peeling back 7 centuries of myth to uncover the man who terrified an empire, the brutality designed to silence him, and the strange, defiant echo that still lingers in Europe's conscience. Stay with me, because what happened to William Wallace wasn't just history, it was a warning. Bound to a rough wooden hurdle, the proud Scotsman was dragged through the muck and mire of London's alleys. Jeers rained down, spit stained his tattered garb, and the crowd's venom marked his final journey. The English crown denied him even the dignity of walking to his fate. Dignity, they decreed, was a luxury he could not have. This was no mere punishment. It was a statement, a chilling message to crush the spirit of a rebellious land. And so the ritual of terror commenced. First they hanged him, the noose tightening until his breath faltered, his eyes dimming at the edge of oblivion. But death was not yet his release. Cut down, gasping, he clung to life, a broken figure in the dust. The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs rising. Here was the true spectacle, the brutal theater of power. With deliberate cruelty, a blade sliced open his abdomen, slow and precise. Before his fading gaze, his intestines were drawn forth, coiling and steaming, then cast into a hungry fire. The air thickened with the scent of burning flesh. Then came the castration, a savage indignity followed by the final act, his heart still pulsing, torn from his chest, a trophy of triumph for his tormentors. Beheaded, quartered. His remains were strewn across the kingdom. London Bridge, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth, grim trophies to mark the reach of royal wrath. This was not about death alone. It was about erasure, a calculated bid to obliterate a man from memory, to silence the whisper of resistance. But they failed. In their ruthless quest to destroy a man, they forged a martyr. William Wallace's name did not fade. It thundered through the ages, etched in the blood and bones of a people unbowed. What the crown intended as an end sparked a beginning, a flame of defiance that would blaze through Scotland's hills and hearts. Who was this man, so feared by kings that they sought to erase him? What spirit burned so fiercely that even in death he defied them? To unravel this mystery, we must journey back, beyond the blades, beyond the betrayal, beyond the rebellion itself. For in the shadow of this brutal dawn lies the story of a warrior, a dreamer, a legend whose echo still stirs the curious, the brave, and the free. Dare you follow? The tale of William Wallace awaits, grit, glory, and a question that lingers. Can a man be broken when his cause lives on? Before the ballads rang through the misty highlands, before legends carved his name into the stone of time, and before monuments towered in defiance, William Wallace was merely a boy. A lad born into a Scotland trembling on the edge of chaos, a land where whispers of war grew louder by the day. When did he first draw breath? The annals of history remain coy, most scholars murmuring of the early 1270s. Where, you ask, the truth dances out of reach. Some point to the rugged hamlet of Elderslie in Renfrewshire, others to the wild beauty of Ayrshire. Like so much of Wallace's saga, the details slip through our grasp, cloaked in the mists of uncertainty. Yet here's what we can glean. No silver spoon graced his cradle, no crown awaited his brow. His father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, was likely a minor landowner, a man of modest standing, respected among his kin, yet far from untouchable in the shadow of greater powers. Young William, however, carried a quiet promise. The church, that ancient guardian of wisdom, likely took him under its wing, schooling him in Latin, the sacred tongue of law and scripture. Whispers linger that he was groomed for the priesthood, a path of peace for a boy with a scholar's mind. But peace was a fleeting guest in his world. In 1296, the storm crashed upon Scotland's shores. Edward I of England, a king with a conqueror's heart, swept in like a tempest, toppling King John Balliol and demanding fealty from Scotland's nobles as if the land were his to claim. His armies surged through Wallace's homeland, torching villages, crushing the people beneath heavy taxes and spilling blood without mercy. This was no distant clash of crowns. This was the stench of smoke, the cries of the broken, the ruin of all young William held dear. This was the fire that forged him, not a prince by birth nor a lord by title, but a boy who watched his world buckle under an invader's heel. I see him now, in my mind's eye, tall for his years, perhaps, with a gaze that burned like embers, a heart hardened by the grit of a nation's suffering. This wasn't a tale of destiny handed down by bloodline. This was the story of a man who made himself a threat, not through rank, but through a conviction that blazed brighter than steel. And like so many who dare to rise first, his journey sparked with something raw, something personal, something brutal. Picture a lad standing amid the ashes of a ravaged home, clenching fists that would one day wield a blade against an empire. What wound ignited that spark? What loss fueled his fury? A father's honor stained, a family torn asunder, or the silent vow of a boy who'd seen too much? Follow this trail, dear reader, and uncover the making of William Wallace, a name that would thunder through the ages, a flame of resistance born from the embers of a shattered land. To grasp the essence of William Wallace, you must first plunge into the Scotland of his birth, a rugged land teetering on the edge of collapse, a nation gripped by crisis and trembling under the shadow of a ruthless neighbor. It began with a shattering blow. In 1286, King Alexander III met his end, tumbling from a cliff in a storm, leaving Scotland adrift. His heir, the fragile young Margaret, Maid of Norway, perished on a treacherous voyage from her northern realm, her small life snuffed out before she could claim the crown. The throne stood empty, a void that unleashed chaos. Noble houses clashed, their ambitions clawing for power, and in their desperation they turned to a dangerous arbiter, Edward I, England's iron-fisted king. But Edward saw more than a dispute to settle, he saw a kingdom to seize. He crowned a puppet, John Balliol, draping the Scottish throne in a hollow pretense of sovereignty, then tightened the strings. He undermined Balliol at every turn, eroding his rule until the beleaguered king dared to defy him. The response was swift and brutal. In 1296, Edward invaded, a conqueror unmasked. Balliol was stripped of his crown, deposed in disgrace, and Scotland fell under the weight of occupation. Edward claimed the land as his own, his ambition bare and unrelenting. This was no gentle conquest. English garrisons sprouted in towns, their banners a grim reminder of subjugation. Castles, once proud symbols of Scottish strength, were wrested away. English law smothered ancient customs, bending a proud people to a foreign will. Nobles faced a bitter choice: kneel and swear fealty to this alien king, or face the axe, lands confiscated, families shamed, lives extinguished. And for the common folk, the heart of Scotland, mercy was a stranger. Taxes bled them dry, soldiers prowled their fields, and fear became their daily bread. This was the crucible William Wallace entered, a world where loyalty was wrung from trembling hands and resistance courted death. I imagine a young man, eyes sharp with defiance, watching from the hills as English boots trampled his homeland, his heart pounding with a refusal to bend. To kneel, for Wallace, the very thought was poison. He chose another way. Not the path of grand speeches or lofty alliances, but a raw, reckless spark, a single act of revenge born from a wound too deep to name. Perhaps a loved one lost, a home torched, or a quiet vow sworn in the dark. Whatever it was, it lit a fire, a blaze that would leap from one man's fury to a nation's uprising. What drove him to that edge? What fanned the flames of rebellion? Step closer and trace the path of William Wallace, a man who turned anguish into action and a shattered Scotland into a battle cry. It began, as so many rebellions do, with a spark of fury, a flame that would blaze through Scotland and sear the name William Wallace into the annals of time. Legend whispers a tale of personal vengeance. They say his wife, or perhaps his beloved, was cut down by an English sheriff, a cruel act of retaliation for Wallace's early defiance. Truth or folklore, the response was undeniable, a storm of wrath. With a handful of loyal men, Wallace descended upon Lanark Castle, a tempest of steel and rage, and slaughtered the sheriff in a bloody reckoning. Fact or fable, the message rang clear as a battle cry. William Wallace would not bow. From that moment, rebellion swept Scotland like wildfire. Wallace struck like lightning, raiding English outposts, ambushing convoys, and rallying men with nothing left to lose. Farmers gripped pitchforks, blacksmiths wielded hammers, sons and fathers rose, their spirits forged in the furnace of humiliation. His army bore no royal banners, no polished armor, no formal training, but it burned with a purpose that no king's gold could buy. Then came the day that shook an empire. Stirling Bridge, September 11th, 1297. The English army marched north, vast, seasoned, and bristling with weapons, confident in their might. They neared a narrow bridge spanning the swirling river Forth, a chokehold of wood and stone. Wallace, alongside the cunning Andrew Moray, watched from the shadows. I see them now in my mind's eye, Wallace, broad-shouldered and fierce, his gaze steady, waiting with a predator's patience. They held their ground. Only when half the English host had crossed, their ranks bunched and vulnerable, did the Scots unleash hell. The bottleneck became a slaughter pen. Trapped, the English flailed, unable to form ranks or swing their blades. Chaos erupted, swords clashed, cries pierced the air, and the river ran red. The Scots gave no quarter. This was no mere battle, it was a humiliation, a defiant roar from a people pushed too far. Thousands of English lay dead, their pride shattered on Scotland's soil. The impossible had been done. In that blood-soaked triumph, Wallace transcended rebellion. He became a hero. Soon after, the land honored him, knighted, named Guardian of Scotland, not a king by blood, but a leader by fire, fighting in the name of a deposed ruler. For the first time in years, Scotland rallied behind a man not born of privilege, but of unyielding purpose. I imagine the cheers of the weary, the hope in their eyes as they looked to Wallace, a beacon in a storm-tossed land. But victories breed enemies as surely as rain feeds rivers. Edward I, the dread hammer of the Scots, turned his cold, vengeful gaze northward, his fury already forging a counter-strike. What drove Wallace to such daring? Was it love's loss, a heart broken by a sheriff's blade, or the raw pulse of a nation crying for freedom? Linger here and follow the saga of a man whose fury lit a rebellion and whose legend still burns bright. Success brings glory, a crown of laurels, but also the crushing weight of expectation. After the triumph at Stirling Bridge, William Wallace was no longer merely a rebel chieftain. Knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, he bore a nation's hopes on his broad shoulders, a beacon in a land starved for freedom. But Edward I, the relentless hammer of the Scots, would not let such defiance stand unchallenged. In July 1298, he stormed back to Scotland, a juggernaut at the head of a massive army, seasoned knights in gleaming armor, cavalry thundering with purpose, siege engines rumbling like harbingers of doom, and thousands of longbowmen, their arrows poised to darken the sky. His mission was clear, not just to defeat Wallace, but to grind the rebellion into dust. The clash came at Falkirk, a field destined for blood. Wallace, ever the tactician, sought to echo his sterling glory. He marshaled his men into schiltrons, tight, bristling circles of spearmen, a wall of thorns to repel the English charge. At Stirling, it had been a masterstroke. But this time, Edward came armed with foresight and archers. A storm of arrows rained down, a lethal deluge from thousands of longbows. The schiltrons stood firm at first, defiant spikes against the tide, but they were pinned, immobile, unable to strike back. It was a butcher's work spearing fish in a barrel. The Scots' resolve buckled, then broke. The field became a slaughter, a chaos of cries and crimson. Wallace slipped away, his life spared, but his army lay in ruins. Soon after, he laid down his guardianship, a heavy choice knowing open leadership had slipped beyond his grasp. Yet defeat did not quench his fire. I envision him, a shadowed figure, unbowed, slipping into the wilds, vanishing like a wisp of smoke. He crossed seas, perhaps to France, maybe even to Rome, a lone warrior pleading Scotland's cause before kings and popes, his voice a desperate ember seeking to kindle foreign aid. But back home, the winds turned chill. Allies dwindled, their courage fading to whispers of caution and compromise. Nobles who once roared his name now murmured of peace at any cost. And somewhere in the flicker of firelit halls, betrayal took root, a serpent coiling in the dark. Did Wallace sense the noose tightening? What drove him through defeat across oceans to fight on? Was it the memory of fallen comrades, the dream of a free Scotland, or a stubborn flame no enemy could douse? Step into this saga and uncover the unyielding heart of William Wallace, a hero tested by loss, hunted by a king, and stalked by treachery. By 1304, the rebellion that once roared across Scotland had dwindled to embers. Edward I, the unyielding hammer of the Scots, clamped his iron grip tighter. Castle after castle crumbled under his might, their stones echoing surrender. Nobles, once bold, bent the knee, their oaths of defiance traded for whispers of submission. The dream William Wallace had poured his blood into was fraying, not shattered by force from without, but eroded by faltering hearts within. And Wallace, he stood alone. Hunted like a wolf, isolated, his face etched in the minds of foes, his name a tremor of fear on English lips. No army rallied at his call now, only a flicker of loyalty lingered in the shadows, a fragile cause few still dared to champion. I see him in my mind's eye, a lone figure cloaked in mist moving through glen and forest, his spirit a stubborn flame against the gathering dark. Still he fought. Still he resisted. But then the blade of betrayal struck. August 1305, near Glasgow, a dagger in the night. Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot, handed him to the English, not in the clash of battle, not after a defiant stand, but in the quiet, cowardly act of surrender. Why? Ambition gnawing at a man's soul, pressure bending a spine to a king's will, survival the desperate plea of a cornered heart. Perhaps all three wove the web that snared him. The result was a bitter truth. Wallace, the Lion of Scotland, was captured, not as a warrior in glory, but as a criminal in chains. Bound and dragged south, he became a symbol not of hope, but of defiance defeated, a trophy for Edward's triumph. Yet even in irons, Wallace refused to bow. I imagine his eyes, fierce and unyielding, meeting the gaze of his captors as they marched him to judgment. In Westminster Hall, they draped him in the charge of treason. His voice rang out, a clarion of truth. I never swore allegiance to Edward. Simple, stark, and damning, a defiance that cut deeper than any blade, but truth held no sway here. The sentence was scrawled before he spoke, the execution already staged. What followed was not justice. It was a warning carved in flesh, a brutal ritual not merely to end a life but to snuff out a legend. They sought to break him, to grind his name into dust, to silence the heartbeat of a nation's hope. And yet, as history would whisper through the ages, they failed. What drove Menteith to betray his kin? How did Wallace's spirit endure such a fall? And why, in the face of a king's wrath, did his legacy only burn brighter? Linger here and unravel the final, defiant chapter of William Wallace, a man chained but never tamed. Smithfield, London, a grim theater of punishment, steeped in the stench of blood and smoke, a stage crafted not for justice but for brutal spectacle. On that fateful August day in 1305, William Wallace, Scotland's defiant son, became the centerpiece of a savage display. No simple gallows awaited him. They dragged him bound to a wooden hurdle, ropes biting his flesh through London's teeming streets. Crowds lined the way, a roiling sea of faces. Some cheered, some spat, others hurled curses at the bruised, naked figure, stripped of all but his resolve. Why such cruelty? Because dignity was a threat, a spark that could reignite rebellion. Killing Wallace wasn't enough for Edward I. They needed to break him publicly, slowly, a lesson etched in agony for all to witness. They hanged. The irony, though, cuts deeper than any blade. They sought to erase him, to snuff out his fire in a blaze of horror. Instead, they fanned the flames. Something stirred in the wake of Smithfield's carnage, something Edward I never foresaw. Whispers of his stand grew into stories, bold and unyielding. Stories swelled into songs, carried on the wind through Scotland's glens. From the ashes of that brutal day, a martyr rose, a symbol not of defeat, but of a spirit unbroken. What strength held Wallace silent through such torment? How did a king's cruel warning birth a legend that echoes still? Linger here and trace the undying spark of William Wallace, torn apart, yet forged anew in the heart of a nation. They thought he would fade, a fleeting spark snuffed out in the flames that consumed his broken body. They believed the horror of Smithfield would sear away his legacy, leaving nothing but ash and silence. But William Wallace did not vanish. He transformed, rising from the embers to ignite a fire that time could not quench. In the years following his brutal end in 1305, Scotland simmered, a cauldron of unrest. Rebellion never truly died, it coiled in the shadows, biding its time. 9 years later, when Robert the Bruce rallied the Scots and triumphed at Bannockburn in 1314, a whisper rippled through the ranks, Wallace's name, spoken not in sorrow but in gratitude. I imagine clansmen by firelight, their voices low, toasting a man whose courage paved their path to victory. He became more than flesh and blood. He became an idea, fierce, untamed, eternal. And ideas, dear reader, are far harder to kill than any man. Centuries later, in the 1470s, a Scottish poet, Blind Harry, wove his tale into the Wallace, a soaring, romanticized epic that crowned him a titan of freedom, a flawless hero striding through legend. Was it pure truth? No, it wasn't meant to be. It was a clarion call crafted to stir hearts, to kindle defiance in a people bowed but unbroken. And inspire it did, its verses echoing through the ages, a beacon in Scotland's darkest hours. Whenever the land strained against English chains, through the Jacobite rebellions, in debates of independence, even now in the quiet, steely pride of a nation, Wallace's name resurfaces, a rallying cry for those who dare to dream of liberty. Near Stirling Bridge, his monument towers not to a perfect man but to the raw courage of an imperfect one, a testament carved in stone against a windswept sky. And perhaps that's the heart of it. Wallace was no saint, no polished symbol in his living days. I see him furious, flawed, relentless, a man of sweat and scars, driven by a fire no empire could douse. He stood against a king's wrath, against an empire's might, against the cold certainty of death. For that his voice rings still, a thunder through the centuries, not because he claimed victory, but because he never bowed. What alchemy turned a man's death into a nation's soul? How does a